In the brutal years after slavery, the American frontier was not just wild, it was cursed. Texas in 1873 was a land where law barely existed, where graves outnumbered churches, and where men vanished without names. Among the whispers of saloons and the crack of gunfire, a single name began to surface, spoken only in fear, never allowed for long. They said he never missed. They said he rode alone at night. They said if you heard his gun, you were already dead. But before he became a legend carved into terror, he was a boy, enslaved, beaten, and forgotten. A child who escaped the chains meant to bury him alive and vanished into the Old West, carrying scars deeper than any bullet wound. What followed was not redemption, but transformation. This is the story of how pain forged a predator, how history created a ghost, and how an enslaved boy became the most feared gunslinger Texas had ever known, leaving bodies, myths, and unanswered questions in his wake. The boy was born into a world that never intended to remember him. His earliest memories were not of a mother's voice or a father's protection, but of iron biting into skin and the smell of sweat soaked into wooden walls. He learned fear before language, learned pain before his own name. The plantation where he was raised treated children not as lives but as future labor, measured by strength and silence. From the moment he could stand, he was taught to lower his eyes, to move when ordered, to disappear when not needed. Every sunrise meant work. Every sunset meant counting bruises in the dark. Even the air felt owned by someone else, heavy with the knowledge that nothing around him belonged to him, not even his own body. The overseer's shadow followed him everywhere, long and thin like a blade stretched across the ground. Mistakes were punished publicly, slowly, so the lesson would burn itself into the minds of others. The boy watched grown men beg, watched women collapse without sound, watched blood soak into dirt that would never remember their names. He learned to make his face empty because emotion invited attention, and attention invited pain. At night, when the world went quiet, he listened to whispers drifting through the slave quarters, stories of escape that never ended well, stories of men torn apart by dogs or dragged back in chains heavier than before. Hope existed, but only as something dangerous, like fire held too close to the skin. Hunger shaped him as much as cruelty did. His body grew lean and hard, forged by endless labor under a sun that showed no mercy. He carried water until his arms shook, lifted loads meant for grown men, and learned how to endure without complaint. Endurance became his first weapon. While others broke loudly, he broke inward, gathering something dark and patient inside himself. He watched everything. The way the overseer walked, the way horses were handled, the way guns were cleaned at the edge of the fields, metal glinting with quiet authority. Those moments fascinated him. Guns ended arguments. Guns made people listen. Guns were feared, and fear, he learned, was power. Violence was not sudden in his life. It was constant and routine. It arrived without warning and left without apology. Once, when he was still barely more than a child, he was forced to watch another boy punished for trying to steal food. The sound that followed was something he would never forget, a dull crack that echoed through his chest long after it faded from the air. That night, sleep did not come. Something shifted inside him, something cold and steady. He understood then that mercy was a lie, told by those who never needed it. Survival belonged to those who learned to become harder than the world around them. There were moments, rare and fragile, when the boy imagined running. He pictured open land, places without fences, places where the sky stretched endlessly without permission. But imagination was dangerous, and he trained himself to bury it deep. Instead, he memorized paths, shadows, routines. He learned when guards changed shifts, which dogs were lazy, which men drank too much to stay alert. This knowledge was not hope, not yet, but it was preparation. Pain had taught him patience. Fear had taught him timing. As years passed, the boy grew into something quieter and more unreadable. His eyes carried a weight that unsettled those who noticed. He spoke little, obeyed quickly, and disappeared into work so completely that he became invisible. That invisibility saved him. It allowed him to survive punishments that killed others, allowed him to move through the plantation like a ghost no one bothered to chase. Inside, however, something sharp was forming, shaped by every scream, every strike, every night spent staring into darkness with fists clenched around nothing. The end of slavery did not bring freedom in the way the stories promised. Chains were removed, but fear remained, and violence simply changed hands. The boy, now older but still treated as expendable, found that the world beyond the plantation was no kinder. Law was distant, protection unreliable. Former masters still held power, still carried guns, still decided who lived comfortably and who did not. The past clung to him like a curse, and he understood that survival would require more than obedience now. It would require transformation. One night, after a beating that left his vision swimming and his mouth filled with blood, something finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. He did not cry. He did not pray. He waited. Pain faded into focus, and focus became resolve. He knew then that staying meant dying slowly, and leaving meant risking everything. Risk no longer frightened him. He had lived with terror so long that it felt familiar, almost comforting. When the moment came, it was silent. No farewell, no witnesses, just a body slipping into darkness, guided by memory and instinct. Each step away from the place that had claimed his childhood felt unreal, like walking out of a grave before the dirt had settled. Behind him lay a life defined by suffering. Ahead of him lay the unknown, wide and merciless, but free of chains, free of masters, free of the boy he had been forced to remain for so long, carrying with him a past, soaked in blood and silence that would never loosen its grip. A past that would follow him into the open land where fear wore different faces and violence spoke a different language, waiting to be reshaped into something far more dangerous. The night he fled did not feel like freedom. It felt like being hunted. Every sound in the darkness became a threat. Every rustle of wind through dry grass mimicked footsteps closing in behind him. The land beyond the plantation was vast and unfamiliar, stripped of paths and borders, offering no shelter except shadow. He moved without a destination, guided only by instinct and the desperate need to put distance between himself and the life he had escaped. Hunger followed him like a second body, gnawing and relentless, while exhaustion pressed down on his bones. But stopping was unthinkable. Stopping meant being found, and being found meant chains, or worse. The world at night was different, cruel in quieter ways. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the open land like warnings. He learned to read the stars without knowing their names, using them to keep moving westward, away from everything familiar. His feet bled, his muscles screamed, and more than once he collapsed behind rocks or trees, forcing himself to remain still until his breath slowed enough not to give him away. Fear sharpened his senses. He noticed things he had never needed to before: the direction of the wind, the smell of water carried through dry air, the faint glow of lanterns miles away that marked places he had to avoid. Days were worse than nights. Sunlight exposed him, stripped away the safety of darkness. He hid when he could, lying motionless as insects crawled across his skin, ignoring the itch and the heat because movement meant death. When he dared to travel by day, he stayed low, using terrain as cover, moving like an animal that had learned the cost of being seen. He drank from muddy streams and ate whatever he could find: roots, stolen scraps, anything that kept his legs moving. Weakness threatened constantly, but fear pushed him forward when strength failed. As he moved deeper into the frontier, the land grew harsher. Towns appeared like mirages, promising safety but hiding danger of their own. He quickly learned that not all chains were iron. Some were laws written for people like him, enforced by men who saw his skin before his humanity. In one town, a glance lasted too long, a hand hovered too close to a weapon, and he slipped away before questions could turn into violence. In another, he watched from the edge, as a stranger was dragged into an alley for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Survival meant knowing when to disappear. Outlaws became as much a threat as lawmen. Bands of men roamed the roads, taking what they wanted, killing without consequence. He witnessed cruelty that mirrored the plantation, different faces but the same hunger for power. Once, he saw a man beaten over a handful of coins, left bleeding in the dust while others laughed. The boy understood then that the world beyond slavery was not kinder, only less predictable. Violence was everywhere, waiting for excuses. He kept his head down, his presence minimal. learning to pass unnoticed among predators. There were moments when despair nearly pulled him under. Nights when cold settled into his bones and the stars felt indifferent, distant witnesses to his suffering. He questioned whether escape had been a mistake, whether the certainty of pain was better than the uncertainty of death. But turning back was impossible. Behind him lay a life already lost. Ahead lay at least the chance of becoming something else. That thought, fragile but persistent, kept him alive. Gradually, he began to learn the rhythms of the frontier. He learned which towns tolerated drifters and which killed them. He learned the sound of danger before it arrived, the tension in voices, the sudden quiet that preceded violence. He learned how men looked at one another before drawing guns, how hands moved, how fear revealed itself in small, telltale ways. These lessons were not taught gently. They came through close calls, through hiding in alleys, through running until his lungs burned and his vision blurred. Work was scarce and often dangerous. He took whatever he could, digging, hauling, cleaning stables, jobs that paid little and demanded much. Each coin earned felt like a victory. Each night survived another step away from the boy he had been. He watched gunslingers from a distance, studying them the way he once studied overseers. He saw how they carried themselves, the calm confidence that made others hesitate. He noticed how a weapon could change the balance in a room, how respect and fear were often the same thing. Trust became impossible. Kindness was rare and often came with conditions. He learned to sleep lightly, to keep his back to walls, to measure people by actions rather than words. The frontier taught him to expect betrayal and to prepare for it. Every encounter carried risk. Every choice had consequences that could end in blood. He adapted, growing harder, more alert, less willing to hesitate. By the time he reached the deeper stretches of the Old West, the boy who had fled in terror no longer existed in the same way. In his place was someone shaped by distance, danger, and constant movement. His past did not fade, but it changed form, becoming fuel rather than weight. The fear that once paralyzed him now sharpened his focus. The pain that once broke him now taught him restraint. He had escaped chains, but the escape itself was forging something new inside him, something alert, controlled, and increasingly comfortable with the idea that survival in this land belonged to those willing to meet violence with equal force, carrying the memory of every step taken in darkness, every narrow escape, every lesson carved into his body by the open, merciless frontier that tested him endlessly and refused to let him remain innocent even for a moment. Violence found him before he ever chose it. In the Old West, survival demanded alignment, and neutrality was often a death sentence. He learned this the hard way when he stumbled into a conflict that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with territory, pride, and guns. A misunderstanding in a dust-choked settlement turned into shouting, shouting into threats, and threats into drawn weapons. He had no gun then, only instinct and the memory of pain. He survived that day by running, but the sound of gunfire followed him long after, echoing in his chest like a warning that he would not always be fast enough. The first gun he touched did not feel like power. It felt heavy, unfamiliar, almost alive. He earned it through labor, weeks of hauling freight for a man who trusted nothing but steel and silence. When the gun was finally pressed into his hand as payment, there was no ceremony, only a nod and a warning to learn fast or die faster. He spent nights alone, practicing the weight, the draw, the aim. His hands shook at first, but repetition steadied them. The discipline he had learned under cruelty now found a new purpose. Where others relied on bravado, he relied on control. Mistakes in the West were fatal, and he watched many men die because they mistook confidence for skill. He paid attention instead. He observed how gunslingers stood, how they waited, how they conserved motion. He learned that speed mattered less than timing, that fear could slow even the fastest hand. His body remembered suffering, remembered how to endure discomfort, and he used that endurance to outlast opponents who relied on intimidation alone. Every encounter became a lesson. Every close call sharpened his awareness. His reputation did not rise suddenly. It grew quietly, carried by whispers and unfinished stories. A man who survived a confrontation he should not have. A drifter who walked away from violence without boasting. Those who crossed paths with him sensed something different, something restrained and dangerous. He did not seek fights, but he did not avoid them when forced. When violence came, it was precise and brief, leaving little room for retaliation or rumor to exaggerate. The absence of spectacle made his actions more unsettling. The frontier tested him constantly. Lawmen saw him as a problem waiting to happen, outlaws as either prey or threat. He belonged fully to neither side. He moved through towns like a shadow, present but unclaimed. In one place he intervened when a man was beaten senseless for a perceived slight, ending the fight before it escalated further. In another, he walked away from a job that demanded cruelty he refused to perform. These choices shaped how others saw him, unpredictable and difficult to control. Gunfights changed him. The first time he fired at another human being, the world narrowed to a single point, the space between his eyes and the target. There was no rage, no satisfaction, only focus. Afterward, the silence felt heavier than the noise had been. He did not celebrate survival. He accepted it as necessity. Each encounter left marks that were not visible, a growing distance between him and the person he might have been in another life. He trained constantly, not out of obsession but caution. Complacency killed faster than any bullet. He practiced drawing until the motion became instinctive, practiced aiming until hesitation disappeared. He learned to read environments, to choose positions that favored survival. Corners, doorways, light, shadow, everything became part of his calculations. The Old West rewarded those who planned and punished those who relied on luck. People began to fear him not because he was cruel, but because he was efficient. Stories spread of confrontations ended before they truly began, of men who underestimated him and never corrected the mistake. Fear grew in the absence of understanding. He did not explain himself, did not correct rumors. Silence allowed myths to flourish, and myths traveled faster than truth. Despite this, he remained isolated. Trust was rare, companionship rarer still. He kept others at a distance, knowing attachment created vulnerability. Nights were often spent alone, the fire low, the gun within reach. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by memories and anticipation. He accepted this as the cost of staying alive. The boy who had once endured pain quietly now endured solitude with the same discipline. As years passed, the violence around him became almost routine, but it never became meaningless. Each decision carried weight. Each life taken or spared added to the invisible ledger he carried within himself. He did not see himself as a hero or a villain, only as someone navigating a world that demanded constant readiness to kill or be killed. The frontier did not care about his past, his suffering, or his intentions. It only responded to action. By the time others began to recognize his name, spoken cautiously and often behind closed doors, he had already accepted what he was becoming. The Old West had forged him the way fire forges steel, stripping away softness, leaving something hard and purposeful behind. He was no longer running from chains or chasing freedom in abstract terms. He was surviving on his own terms now, shaped by every violent encounter, every lesson learned at the edge of death, every moment when restraint proved stronger than rage, carrying forward with a calm that unsettled those who crossed his path, and a reputation built not on spectacle, but on certainty, moving steadily toward a future defined less by who he had been and more by what the frontier demanded he become. By 1873, fear followed his name faster than he could outride it. He never announced himself, never sought recognition, yet towns seemed to sense his arrival before he spoke a word. Conversations softened when he entered a room. Chairs scraped back just enough to create space. Eyes lingered on his hands, measuring distance, imagining outcomes. He carried himself with a stillness that unsettled people more than aggression ever could. There was no rush in him, no wasted motion, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided how things would end if pushed too far. Stories spread along cattle trails and through saloons thick with smoke and sweat. They spoke of gunfights that ended in seconds, of men who reached for weapons and never finished the thought. Some claimed he could draw faster than sight. Others said he waited, letting his opponent expose themselves through fear. The details changed with every retelling, but the result never did. He walked away. Someone else did not. The lack of drama made the stories darker, as if violence performed without emotion was more terrifying than rage-fueled slaughter. Texas in those years was a land stretched thin by lawlessness. Sheriffs were outnumbered, judges distant, justice inconsistent. In this vacuum, reputations became currency. His grew heavy with implication. Outlaws debated whether to recruit him or avoid him. Lawmen debated whether arresting him was worth the risk. Some tried to test the stories, convinced no man could be as dangerous as rumor suggested. Those men did not get second chances. The frontier remembered outcomes more than intentions. He did not kill indiscriminately. That distinction mattered to him, even if it meant nothing to those who feared him. Violence was a tool, not a pleasure. When he used it, it was decisive, final, leaving no room for escalation. This restraint confused people. They expected cruelty to look a certain way, loud and theatrical. Instead, they found something colder, more controlled, a presence that suggested calculation rather than chaos. Fear thrives in uncertainty, and he embodied it. There were towns that barred him without explanation, notices passed quietly among proprietors and deputies. There were others that welcomed him reluctantly, knowing that his presence alone discouraged trouble. Fights died before they began. Men chose silence over bravado. He became a walking boundary line, an unspoken rule enforced by reputation alone. Even those who despised him benefited from the order his shadow imposed. Encounters with other gunslingers were inevitable. Some sought him out, driven by pride or desperation, hoping to claim his reputation as their own. These confrontations were the most dangerous, not because of skill alone, but because of ego. He approached them without malice, aware that hesitation could be fatal. He read their posture, their breathing, the tension in their hands. The moment always came when intent turned into action, and when it did, he was ready. Survivors spoke of his eyes, not angry, not excited, just focused, as if the rest of the world had fallen away. The cost of this reputation was isolation. He could not linger anywhere for long. Familiarity bred fear, and fear turned quickly into hostility or plots. He slept lightly, moved often, left towns before comfort could become vulnerability. Companionship was dangerous, loyalty unreliable. He learned to rely on himself alone, trusting his instincts more than promises. Nights were spent listening to the sounds of a town settling into uneasy sleep, aware that someone might be waiting for the chance to test the legend. Lawmen approached him carefully when they did at all. Some saw him as a necessary evil, others as a threat to order. Attempts to arrest him were rare and cautious, often abandoned before they began. Paper warrants meant little without the will to enforce them. He understood this balance and never pushed it unnecessarily. He avoided killing lawmen when possible, knowing that such an act would tip the scales decisively against him. Survival meant knowing where lines existed, even when others ignored them. Despite the fear surrounding him, there were moments when his humanity surfaced unexpectedly. A glance lingered on a child too thin for their age, a coin left behind where it was needed, small acts unnoticed by most, dismissed by others as coincidence. These moments did not soften his reputation, but they complicated it. People struggled to reconcile the monster of rumor with the man who passed through their lives, leaving behind silence instead of ruin. The West itself seemed to respond to him differently. Dust storms swallowed towns he had just left. Trails he traveled became sites of ambushes that never reached him. Superstition crept into the stories, whispers that death followed him, that he carried a curse born of suffering too deep to fade. He did nothing to deny or confirm these claims. Mystery served him better than truth. By the height of his infamy, his name was enough to stop violence before it began. Men chose different routes. Deals were reconsidered, betrayals postponed. Fear became a tool that worked without bloodshed, and he wielded it unknowingly. He was no longer just a man moving through Texas, but an idea, a warning shaped by history and rumor carried on the wind from one settlement to the next. Yet beneath the legend, the weight grew heavier. Every story added distance between him and the possibility of peace. The enslaved boy who had once dreamed of open land had found it, only to discover that freedom came with a price measured in isolation and constant vigilance. The West had given him power, but it demanded perpetual readiness in return, shaping his existence into a narrow path where reputation replaced identity and fear became both shield and prison, tightening around him with every whispered retelling, every avoided glance, every town that fell silent at his arrival and held its breath until he was gone. The end did not come with a gunshot or a witness. It arrived quietly, like so many other things in his life, leaving behind questions instead of answers. One season, he was there, his name still heavy in the mouths of men who spoke it carefully, and the next, he was gone, dissolved into the vastness of the land that had shaped him. Some said he rode south under a different name, shedding his reputation the way a snake sheds its skin. Others claimed he was finally caught by a bullet meant for him all along, buried somewhere unmarked where the dust quickly erased all evidence of his passing. The truth slipped through fingers like sand, impossible to hold. Towns remembered him differently. In one place he was recalled as a necessary presence, a man whose arrival ended feuds without words. In another he was remembered as a curse, a shadow that brought unease and silence. Stories contradicted one another, overlapping and colliding until the man beneath them became indistinguishable from the myth. Each retelling added something new, exaggerated a detail, erased a doubt. Over time, the facts mattered less than the feeling he left behind, the lingering sense that violence could wear a calm face and still be deadly. Historians would later argue over fragments, a name in a ledger that vanished after 1873. A newspaper clipping describing a gunslinger without ever printing his full identity. Oral accounts passed down through families who swore they had seen him, spoken to him, watched him walk away into dust and heat. None of it aligned cleanly. It was as if the land itself refused to keep him pinned to one ending, allowing him to remain unfinished, unresolved, forever in motion. There were those who insisted he sought peace at the end, that the weight of fear and isolation finally became too heavy to carry. They imagined him settling somewhere quiet, far from Texas, laying down his gun and living out his days in obscurity. It was a comforting thought, but one that did not fit easily with the man they described. Peace had never been something the world offered him freely. It had always been conditional, fragile, temporary. Others believed he met a violent end, that the life he lived could only conclude in blood. They pointed to the inevitability of the frontier, the way it consumed those who thrived within it. According to these stories, his skill failed him once, just once, and that was enough. No legend survives perfection forever. Somewhere, they said, lies a grave that does not bear his name, because no one knew what to carve into the stone. What remained undeniable was his impact. Long after his disappearance, his reputation continued to shape behavior. Men hesitated where they once rushed. Guns stayed holstered a moment longer. The idea of him lingered like a warning, a reminder of what pain and survival could create when left unchecked. In a land built on conquest and cruelty, he became a reflection of its darkest truths, not as an outsider, but as a product of its history. The enslaved boy he once was faded into obscurity, his suffering unrecorded, his childhood unmarked by monuments or sympathy. Yet that boy's endurance lived on in the legend that followed. Every calculated movement, every restrained act of violence traced back to years spent learning how to survive without being seen. The West did not invent him. It only revealed what had already been forged under whips and chains. There is an unease in stories like his because they resist simple judgment. He was neither hero nor monster in the way stories prefer. He was something in between, shaped by forces larger than himself, responding to a world that had shown him little mercy. To condemn him outright feels incomplete. To glorify him feels dishonest. His existence challenges the idea that history produces clean outcomes or clear morals. Even now, his story unsettles because it suggests continuity. The violence did not begin with him, and it did not end with his disappearance. He was one chapter in a longer narrative, one shaped by exploitation, fear, and the absence of justice. The Old West is often remembered through myths of freedom and opportunity, but his legend exposes the cost of those myths, paid in blood and silence by those pushed to the margins. Perhaps that is why his ending remains unknown. An unresolved fate suits a life defined by uncertainty. To pin him down with a final moment would be to simplify what cannot be simplified. He belonged to the in-between spaces, between slavery and freedom, between law and lawlessness, between man and myth. His disappearance preserved that ambiguity, allowing him to exist forever as a question rather than an answer. Some nights, along forgotten trails and near abandoned towns, people still claim to feel his presence, not as a ghost, but as a memory embedded in the land itself. A reminder that the past does not stay buried, that suffering echoes forward, shaping lives long after the original wounds have closed. The most frightening part of his story is not how many he killed or how feared he became, but how easily a broken child was transformed into a legend of violence by a world that offered no other path, leaving behind a legacy that refuses to settle into history, lingering instead like a shadow at the edge of the firelight. watching, waiting, unfinished, as if the story itself is still moving through time, searching for a place to finally come to rest, or perhaps never intending to stop at all, drifting endlessly across the open land where dust covers tracks but never truly erases them, where names fade but consequences remain, and where the line between victim and monster blurs until it disappears into the same darkness that once hid a fleeing boy and later swallowed a feared gunslinger whole, without ceremony, without closure, without a final word. Only the quiet understanding that some stories are meant to remain open, stretching forward without resolution, like the frontier itself, wide, unforgiving, and still whispering of him as though he might ride out of the night again, unchanged, unseen, and forever just beyond reach.